If you are a fan of this little candy that's called Skittles, you might be surprised to find out that the purple Skittle in the United States has a completely different flavor than the purple Skittle in the United Kingdom. In the United States, the purple Skittle is a kind of a generic grape flavor that's used in many candies, but in the United Kingdom, the purple Skittle is a flavor with which many Europeans are familiar, that the New York Times describes as deep and musky with a mouth-puckering sourness. It's blackcurrant. And the reason that the Wrigley company that makes Skittles doesn't serve blackcurrant Skittles to the United States is that the American palate is almost completely unfamiliar with it. In fact, Marvin Pitts, a professor of horticulture at Cornell University, suggests that 99.9% of Americans have never tasted it. Why? Because for nearly a century, the United States government fought a war against currants and gooseberries. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Ribies are a genus of medium shrub-like plants. The journal Hort Science explained in 1996 that about 150 species of the genus Ribies are found throughout the northern portion of the northern hemisphere, along the Andes Mountains in South America and in northwest Africa along the Mediterranean. Plants of the genus produce berries, black currants, red currants, white currants, gooseberries, and yosta berries, a hybrid of black currants and gooseberries. These berries are very nutritionally dense. The website Very Well Fit explains that currants may be tiny, but they pack a big nutritional punch. Like other berries, they are excellent sources of fiber, vitamin C, and antioxidants, especially the flavonoid anthocyanin. Likewise, the website Healthwise explains that gooseberries are low in calories and fat, but rich in dietary fiber, copper, manganese, potassium, and vitamins C, B5, and B6. The nutritional value of the berries seems to have been recognized early on. Hort Science writes that herbalists collected Ribies fruit from the wild for use in medicines as early as the 1400s, and domestication efforts began during the 1500s. The website Uncommon Fruits notes that currants were discovered to have a soothing effect on sore throats, which is now attributed to its high vitamin C content. The website Townsend's explains that they are extremely high in vitamin C. On average, 6 blackcurrant berries contain the same amount of vitamin C as does an entire lemon. Blackcurrants were also used in the 18th and 19th centuries as a throat lozenge. They often went by the name Kinsey berries, used to treat Kinsey's, a chronic tonsil condition. Hort Science continues that by the 1700s, red currants and gooseberries were popular garden fruits in Western Europe, and black were sold in farmers' markets in Russia. White, black, and red currants have many culinary uses in Europe, where they are commonly used in jellies and sauces. The New York Times explains that Austrians often serve currant sauces with game, just as the British serve roasts with Cumberland sauce currants or currant jelly stewed with port, orange juice, and zest. Red currants are usually used in Cumberland sauce, but black currants have a deeper flavor. Dried black currants have been described as the fruit of choice for traditional English scones, and currants of all kinds are popular all over Europe, used in jellies and preserves. Black currants are also used in the popular drink Ribena. The newspaper The Guardian explains that, named after the plant's Latin name, Ribies nigrum, Ribena was developed by the Bristol-based food and drink company, H.W. Carter, and launched in 1938. Because black currants have a high vitamin C content, free Ribena was given to children during the Second World War, when fruits such as oranges became hard to get. The Guardian notes that around 90% of the black currants grown in the UK today are used to make Ribena. It's important to note that the word currant also applies to a wholly different fruit. Townsend explains that there are 2 basic kinds of currants used in cooking, the half-pint raisin type and the cousin to the gooseberry type. The small raisins are not ribies at all, but actual raisins, processed from small seedless Corinth grapes. Although the 2 are not closely related plants, these grapes, grown in Greece and cultivated as early as the 14th century, were possibly confused with actual currants. Townsend writes that early attempts to grow grapes of Corinth in northern Europe failed, and some sources suggest that upon the successful cultivation of the ribies bush, a common misconception arose that the ribies bush was the plant from which Zente currants were derived. The name currant was misapplied as a result. Townsend speculates that the cultivation of ribies was an attempt to create a local source, as Britain has a long history of high tariffs on raisins. The closely related gooseberry has also long been popular in the United Kingdom and Northern Europe. The website British Food History explains that although sometimes served with goose, it is not the origin of the gooseberry's name, as you might assume. It comes from the Old Norman Middle English grossus or grossier, the old word for, wait for it, grossielle, the French for red currant. So in effect, we called gooseberries red currant berries. All of these words came from the Frankish root crussel, which means crisp berry, and the gooseberry certainly is that. British food history continues. Gooseberries were extremely popular and have been cultivated in Britain since at least the 15th century. They were important because they were the first soft fruit of the summer, cropping well as far north as the Shetland and Orkney Islands. In the Midlands and northern England, they were revered, a tradition of competitive growing quickly developing. There was a single aim in these competitions, to grow the heaviest berry. These clubs were widespread, and at one point there were 170 growing clubs, and a handful still exists today in Yorkshire and Cheshire. To achieve heavy berries, by the way, you must strip your shrub of berries as soon as they appear, leaving behind a dozen or so that the plant can put all its energy into growing just a few fruits. But what about the United States? If ribies are popular elsewhere, why are they hardly known here? In fact, the University of Missouri notes that in the United States there are about 50 native species of ribies, including the American gooseberry. Moreover, ribies were once widely cultivated in the United States. Hort Science explains that domestic currants and gooseberries were introduced into the United States in the 1700s, and by 1920 there were more than 3,000 hectares in commercial production. Most of the farms were concentrated in the Middle Atlantic, Upper Midwest, and Northeastern states. New York was the leading state for currant production, followed by Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Minnesota, Missouri, Colorado, Washington, and California. Marin County, Oregon was the only county in the United States with more than 40 hectares of commercial gooseberries. Fruit growers also produce gooseberries in Michigan, Washington, and Colorado. As the blackcurrant has a stronger flavor that Americans apparently didn't prefer, Hort Science explains that red and white currants made up nearly all of the ribies production in the United States. The UK newspaper The Sun explains that blackcurrant bushes were grown in America as early as the 1600s, when British settlers brought the fruit to be cultivated on a large scale. By the late 1800s, U.S. farmers grew around 7,400 acres of blackcurrants, gooseberries, and white currants, with New York leading the way in production. But in the early 1900s, farmers realized the blackcurrant was threatening an even bigger U.S. industry: timber. Forestry expert Warren Benedict with the U.S. Department of Agriculture explains in his work A History of White Pine Blister Rust Control a personal account. This story has its beginning in Geneva in central New York State in 1909, when blister rust was discovered in a plantation of young white pines growing from planting stock imported from Europe. This discovery raised significant alarm. Benedict continues. While there had been several earlier findings, including some diseased currant bushes near a Geneva nursery in 1906 and a few scattered sightings dating back to 1898, it was the 1909 discovery that flashed the red light of danger ahead. But what does white pine blister rust, a fungus that affects 5-needled pine trees, have to do with currants and gooseberries? Benedict explains. White pine blister rust is known as a heteroecious rust fungus, a parasitic fungus that requires two distinctly different and often unrelated species or genera of alternate host plants to complete its life cycle. He notes that blister rust has as its primary host the white pines and doesn't attack the other pines. 7 species of white pine are native to North America, and 3 of these have great commercial value: eastern and western white pine and sugar pine. The secondary host for blister rust can be either currant or gooseberry bushes, which are known collectively by botanists as ribies. Blister rust is relatively harmless to currant and gooseberry bushes, but can kill white pine trees of all sizes. This shows the risk of ribies. The spores that spread the fungus from pines to ribies are tough and can be blown long distances. But the spores produced by the infected ribies are, Benedict explains, relatively heavy and quite fragile. He goes on. These spores usually do not remain viable long enough to transmit infection to pines more than a few hundred yards away. By removing the ribies from within and for several hundred yards around white pine stands, the stands can usually be completely protected. Thus, forestry officials surmised, to protect the pines, the ribies must go. The Stockton, California Evening and Sunday Record wrote in August 1922, white pine blister rust is a destructive disease of 5-needled pines and was first reported from Western Europe, where the eastern white pine was grown commercially on an extensive scale. The rust made such an attack on the pine that even attempts at its control were a dismal failure, and growing eastern white pines in Europe was abandoned. The paper doesn't mince words in its opinion of the white pine blister rust. White pine blister rust is a parasitic fungus, a microscopic plant which, like the human professional tramp, believes that the world owes it a living, and forthwith proceeds to take it from a living pine tree. The paper goes on to make a surprising literary reference. We've all read Robert Louis Stevenson's weird tale of a double personality, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In the white pine blister rust and many other rusts, we have actually this dual personality, but with the important difference that the Stevenson conception of it, wherein the genial Dr. Jekyll was the personification of benevolence and in his Mr. Hyde condition just the reverse, both stages of this white pine blister rust, one of five-leaf pine and the other of currants and gooseberries, are equally malevolent. But then comes the important part. While ribies were a popular crop, they were not nearly as valuable as the timber they threatened. Evening Sun and Record writes, now we have in the West Forest of five-leaved pine value at over $228 million, estimated to contain over 57 billion feet of lumber. If we should have a 25% loss of this pine timber within the next 6 years, what would be the effect on the price of lumber? And does not wish even to imagine the devastation that would be done to our glorious beauty spots, a wonder and solace to the tourist when away from him on a summer vacation. The paper explains what must be done. The effective control of the disease consists either of cutting down all the pines where it occurs, or else digging up and burning all the currants and gooseberries in the vicinity of the pines. The latter method is the one most feasible. The Philadelphia Inquirer wrote in 1910, the remedy, therefore, is simple. Wherever the pest is found, the ribies bushes will be ordered removed. This is the only known remedy. Thus, the berries had to be sacrificed to save the pines. In Europe, however, the opposite choice was made. Business Insider notes that in contrast to the United States, Europe had few commercial pine tree plantations. Black currants, on the other hand, had been an important crop for a long time. Benedict writes that, in Europe, the white pine was sacrificed to retain the ribies. The first U.S. government reaction, described in the 1912 Quarantine Act, was to ban the import of white pine from Europe, expanded in 1913 to ban the import of white pine from any country, thus preventing the import of infected trees. But as the blister rust was already invading forests, a further step was necessary. War against ribies, the Department of Agriculture writes. The project was military in its size, scope, and organization. The government established an Office of Blister Rust Control and engaged in an aggressive policy of ribies removal, recommending that all ribies be destroyed within 200 to 300 yards of white pine stands and that black currants be outlawed in all states where white pines grew. Ribies eradication, Benedict writes, was the bread and butter job, the payoff resulting from other blister rust control activities. It was a summer job, one that could be effectively undertaken only during the period when ribies were in leaf and readily visible to search crews. Benedict describes these summer jobs as being rough work, with workers spending 3 months away from civilization in rag camps, meaning a camp of tents instead of wooden structures. Workers were required to build their own shelter. Usually 2 men teamed up to build a 2-person lean-to. Beds were made of tree boughs, and bedding was 3 government-issued woolen army blankets. He explains 2 30-man camps operated in Upper Priest River during 1924 and 1925. Each camp had a camp boss, cook, flunky, 4 crew members, 5 4-man crews, and 3 scouts. The labor force consisted of forestry school students seeking woods experience and the chance to earn some money to continue their education. Saving these earnings was easy, he writes. Aside from an occasional poker game for small stakes, there was no way to let summer wages slip through the fingers. While the process took time to perfect, these camps were incredibly effective. The Portland, Maine Press-Herald wrote in 1925 that an extensive and determined battle is being carried on by federal and state forces in Maine against the blister rust is shown by a statement made to the Sunday Telegram writer at the Washington office of the U.S. Blister Rust Control that last year, 1,108,518 acres of land in the white pine section were cleared of wild currant and gooseberry bushes. The number of bushes destroyed totaled 4,164,255. From 1918, when the U.S. Blister Rust Control first came into existence, up to the 1st of 1925, there have been a total of 36 million wild currant and gooseberry bushes destroyed in the state of New York and the New England states. The Ribies War was very effective. Currants and gooseberries became, in the United States, nearly forgotten history, the New York Times explained in 2009. In 1919, New York produced 3.3 million quarts of the nation's 7.6 million quart annual currant production. Now the United States currant crop is too small to be reported by the Agricultural Department, said Danny L. Barney, a horticultural professor and a fruit breeder at the University of Idaho, who's been working to promote a currant industry in America. People simply forgot about them, he said. The white pine blister rust continued to spread, and in fact it's still a pest today, but Benedict argues that the rate at which the pines were being damaged was significantly retarded by the millions of ribies that were destroyed. Although they certainly weren't entirely successful, my mother insists that when she was a child growing up in the 1940s, that her grandmother made jams and jellies from currants and gooseberries from wild bushes in New Mexico. The federal ban on cultivating ribies bushes was lifted in 1966 and regulation was left up to the states, but owing to the value of the white pine, most states continued to prohibit the cultivation of ribies bushes clear until the 21st century. The ban was only lifted in New York in 2003. And today, in an era when they've developed both types of pine trees and types of ribies bushes that are resistant to the blister rust, there is a growing industry of ribies bushes in the United States, but still more than 99% of the currants and gooseberries grown in the world today are grown in Europe. Because here in the United States, we've still not decided whether the berry that has been described as a cross between a blueberry and a cranberry deserves to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.